Okay, so we're going to now start looking at the endnotes for my article, a couple of them, just to give you a sense of how citation works. Now, as I suggest, or let me suggest it again if I forgot, I would have two copies of the PDF I sent open. The first copy so you can look at the text, the second one so you can go straight to footnotes. Footnotes start on page 244. And it's just, I think it's easier to toggle between the two, but you don't have to. I just think it's easier. So, where's footnote one? Footnote one of my article is on page 224. It's at the top of the page, in the middle of the third sentence after San Luis Potosi. You'll see footnote one. Okay. Now, what I've done, and you don't have to go back and read this. What I've done in the previous two paragraphs, I've kind of told the broad story of the French intervention into Mexico. That the French Emperor Napoleon III tried to put an emperor in Mexico, Maximilian of Austria, during the Civil War. Okay, I'm not making any grand claims that have to be backed up. People that would be reading this article know the basics of this story. Okay, so what I'm doing in footnote one, and let's go ahead and go to footnote one, which is on the top of page 244. I've just offered two sites, a book by McGowan and a book by the Hannahs. And this is a classic example of a historian telling another scholar, hey, if you're interested in this topic, I'm going to suggest two books for you to read. Let me tell you, there's hundreds of books on this topic, but publishers don't want they don't want long footnotes anymore because it costs them money, and publishers are really strapped for cash these days. So in the old days, I might have put five or six books to send scholars to, five or six books on this topic that I think that scholars might find useful. These days, though, publishers don't want that. They want you to be concise. So I've just listed two books. And so what I'm saying, and another scholar would recognize this instantly, it's like, hey, if you're interested in this topic, I've got two suggestions for you. One's a recent book. It was published, as you'll see, in 2014. Another one's an older book, but it's a real classic that came out in 1971. And so if you're interested in this topic, here's two books. Any scholar would know that there's far more than two books on this topic. There's many more. No one's going to be fooled. I'm not trying to trick anybody. I'm just listing what I thought were two of the better books that I used in writing the article. So in this footnote, I'm just letting people know books that I thought were useful if they wanted to go check out these books if they're studying this topic themselves. Okay. Now let's go back to footnote two, which is kind of a more classic footnote. Um, so footnote two comes in the next paragraph. It's the first full paragraph on page 224, and I've quoted the Richmond Dispatch on July 25th, 1863. What's happened is the French have conquered Mexico City, and the Richmond Dispatch, which Richmond it was the capital of the Confederacy. The Confederacy is very enthusiastic about the French trying to put in an emperor into Mexico because the Confederates believed that the French would create an alliance with the Confederacy against the Union. Okay, just to give you a thumbnail sketch. So the Confederacy is very supportive and they're very excited about the success of the French. And this is what this quote shows. Uh, I'll go ahead and read it, but you can read it yourself. The French will be the best neighbors for us we could possibly have. We could strike up an immense trade with them, and the two peoples will form an alliance, offensive and defensive, which will set the world in defiance. Then you see in note 2. Well, that's a beautiful quote. It says just what I wanted it to say. It's just one of those quotes that when you find it in your research, you go, okay, I'm going to use that quote. That's perfect. And so that's footnote 2. Well, let's go now back to footnote 2, or footnote in note 2 on page 244. And you'll see something kind of interesting. Okay, so I claim in the text that the Richmond Dispatch, that quote came from the Richmond Dispatch. Richmond's a city in Virginia, and this Dispatch is a newspaper. Note, by the way, that titles are, newspaper titles are always italicized. Students often make that mistake. Always italicize the newspaper title. Anyway, so let's look at footnote 2. Let's read footnote 2 together. So it says Richmond Dispatch, July 25th, 1863. Okay, so I'm telling my reader that I claim that this quote came from this newspaper on this date, right? But here's the tricky part of footnote number 2. I didn't find this quote in the Richmond Dispatch. I found it in the Chicago Tribune. And here's what's happening. I was looking at the Chicago Tribune, the August 1st, 1863 edition of the Chicago Tribune. And what the Chicago Tribune did, thankfully, was reprinted an article from the Richmond Dispatch. And this is neither here nor there, but I'll just go ahead and say it. One of the great things, I'm a Civil War historian, and it was fantastic how often newspapers would reprint articles from other newspapers. I found so much great material that way. So, okay, let's return to footnote 2. So, what I'm telling my reader in footnote 2 is, hey, I'm quoting something from the Richmond Dispatch from July 25th, 1863, but I'm being honest. I didn't find it in the Richmond Dispatch. Where I found this quote was in the Chicago Tribune on August 1st, 1863. Now, am I positive that the Chicago Tribune quoted the Richmond Dispatch correctly? I don't know. I didn't go back and check it. I just had to trust the Chicago Tribune. I feel quite confident that it's a direct quote, but I just don't have time. And by the rules that we play as historians, if one newspaper reprints an article from the other newspaper, in this case the Chicago Tribune reprinted the Richmond Dispatch, it's okay for me to use the Chicago Tribune reprint without having to go back and checking the original source. And what I've done in this footnote, I'm telling my reader two things. I'm saying, okay, I found that in the Chicago Tribune, and if you look at the Chicago Tribune on August 1st, 1863, you'll see that the article was reprinted from the Richmond Dispatch. But if you want to go ahead and double check, or you think that there's more information that you might find, the article came from the Richmond Dispatch on July 25th, 1863, so you can go ahead and check that article too. And what I want to stress to you is that it's always worthwhile, if you have time, to double check both the Chicago Tribune and the Richmond Dispatch, not to see if I'm lying about this quote, but because there's been an article on this topic, and just because I used one quote doesn't mean that there won't be other quotes in the Richmond Dispatch or even the Chicago Tribune that aren't worth using as well. So one of the things I always tell students, if you find an interesting quote from a primary document and the author has only quoted one sentence, go ahead and look at the citation. Go ahead and look at the document, especially since it's so easy to find it now, because you might find a quote that the author, that in this case, that I didn't care about, but that might be perfect for your research. So don't think just because I've quoted something from a primary source that you shouldn't go double check that primary source, not necessarily to make sure that I'm telling the truth, although you could do that, but because there might be information in that site that you might find useful that I didn't care about, but you might find really important.